seeking peace and justice. The Archbishop of Saint Louis acts to counter violent protests in Ferguson. Deeply pained, Pope Francis grieves for family members who died in a car crash. Unmistakable voice. His face may not be familiar, but we know his voice. Don Pardo has died. And vision on the field. How blind kickball is empowering kids. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, August 19th, 2014. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Protesters and police clash again in Ferguson, Missouri. With no end to the violence in sight, the Archdiocese of Saint Louis is stepping up with a call for peace. Our Jason Calvi is here with that story and other developments tonight. Jason?
Brian, in many ways, the church is trying to bring calm to the chaos, peace to the problems, and it's needed. 31 were arrested last night. 4 officers were injured by rocks or bottles. People continue protesting the death of 18-year-old Michael Brown. Tonight, Ferguson's mayor is urging residents to stay home. The National Guard is also on site in Ferguson. A spokesman for the St. Louis County prosecuting attorney says a grand jury could begin to look at evidence tomorrow. They'll be deciding if the officer should be charged in the death of Brown. And U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder is heading to Ferguson to meet with FBI and other officials. And tonight, a call for prayer.
Tensions flare for another night here in Ferguson.
You are unlawfully assembled. You need to get out of the roadway. Right here.
But there's a part of the story you might not have seen.
We pray. Lord God, we are weary, but we come to you today that you may continue to fill us with your Spirit.
Besides this Lutheran minister, priests of the Archdiocese of Saint Louis are caring for the police and the people.
People who are afraid, people who are hurting, people who are angry.
St. Louis Archbishop Robert Carlson has visited Ferguson.
My heart is very, very sad. At the same time, we have to pray for peace and justice.
At Blessed Teresa of Calcutta Parish in Ferguson, nearly 200 people gathered last night for a rosary rally. Father Robert Rosie Rosenbrow spoke with the Sunrise Morning Show today.
The riots or the violence is not the whole story of Ferguson. And that's kind of sad, because when all you do is a first impression is your last impression many times.
As these explosive images fill TV screens across the nation, the St. Louis Archbishop is asking for your help.
That's the most powerful thing they can do, and we would be supported by their prayer.
And that could have lasting impact here in Ferguson.
The issues will not go away when a lot of media leaves this week or next week. The problems are still there, and how do we address them is that's most important.
And you can hear the full interview with Father Rosie tomorrow morning on the Sunrise Morning Show on EWTN Radio. The St. Louis Archbishop will celebrate a Mass for peace and justice tomorrow at the Cathedral Basilica. Brian?
Thank you, Jason Calvi. And a New York district attorney will ask a grand jury there to look into whether police officers went too far trying to make an arrest in July. Police say the suspect, Eric Garner, kept pulling away when officers tried to put his hands behind his back. One officer then put Garner into a chokehold. Garner complained that he couldn't breathe, and he eventually died. That sparked an outcry from the community. A grand jury indictment would bring that case to trial. Some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. Texas Governor Rick Perry is booked tonight after being indicted by a grand jury. Now, he's not formally under arrest, but this marks the start of a criminal investigation. Wyatt Goolsby joining us, reporting on the possible long-term national implications of this.
Yes, Brian, we've learned that Rick Perry will turn himself into authorities in Texas tonight on 2 counts of abuse of power. It means he'll be fingerprinted and have his mugshot taken, but he says he hasn't done anything wrong and that his indictment is politically motivated.
The charges leveled against the governor are a really nasty attack.
The head of Governor Perry's team of high-powered attorneys lashed out Monday, challenging the accusations against his client, saying they have no merit.
Perry is the first Texas governor to be indicted since 1917. It all stems from allegations Perry forced a district attorney to resign after she got a DWI. The indictment accuses Perry of using a veto threat to withhold state money from the same ethics group the district attorney ran. Over the weekend, Perry defended his actions.
Just as I have, following every legislative session during my service as governor, I exercise this authority to veto funding for an office whose leadership had lost the public's confidence by acting inappropriately and unethically.
Some have said the accusations could become a major hurdle for a potential presidential candidate in 2016. But Philip Klein with the Washington Examiner tells EWTN News Nightly it may not be a big issue in the long run.
Most people from across the political spectrum have seen it as pretty thin gruel. There's not much merit to the idea that if you threaten to veto something, that somehow this is an abuse of power. It's very typical.
Assuming he's not found guilty, Klein says politically, Perry's team may use the situation to their advantage and paint Perry as a candidate who stands up for principle.
Particularly in a Republican primary, oftentimes one of the things that Republicans can do to endear themselves to the conservative electorate is to present themselves as somebody who's being persecuted for their ideas and for trying to fight for conservative values.
If Perry is convicted, he could face 99 years in jail, but the indictment is not interrupting his schedule. This week, he's supposed to travel to early primary states, South Carolina and New Hampshire, to meet with Republican activists. So, Brian, it's certainly something we're going to continue to follow.
Well, the trial will get a lot of coverage, I'm sure, which will certainly lend to his name and face recognition.
Yes, certainly in the next few weeks.
All right. Thank you, Wyatt Goolsby. A nephew of Pope Francis is in critical condition after an accident in Argentina takes the lives of his wife and his 2 young children. The family was returning to Buenos Aires after a holiday weekend when their car hit the back of a large truck. The nephew is the son of the Holy Father's brother. Vatican spokesman Father Federico Lombardi says the Pope is asking all who share in his grief unite with him in prayer. Well, concern over a possible Ebola case in Berlin caused a lockdown there today. A job center worker who recently traveled to Africa collapsed at work. About 600 people were caught in this lockdown, which was taken as a precaution. Now, the Wall Street Journal reports tonight that after some screening, German health officials do not suspect the woman was actually sick with Ebola. A few days ago, the government in Germany advised its citizens to leave several West African nations affected by this outbreak. The global Ebola outbreak, the death toll, has now topped 1,200. Well, a step backwards in the quest for Middle East peace. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is recalling his negotiators from Cairo. Peace talks are at a standstill after more rocket attacks from Palestinian militants were met with return airstrikes from Israel. Israeli leaders insist they will not negotiate while under fire. The Obama administration wants to change the nation's much-debated no-fly list for air travel. While offering few details, we should say, the government stated in a recent court ruling it will, quote, endeavor to increase transparency for certain individuals denied boarding who believe they are on the no-fly list. It's been government policy to neither confirm or deny names that are listed. The list was created after the 9/11 attacks to keep suspected terrorists off airplanes. Over the years, it's grown to about 48,000 names. That list has been challenged because those on it have no recourse to argue the government's designation. You may not recognize the face, but does this voice sound familiar?
If you want a program to have any longevity, you must hire me as your announcer.
Many shows did just that. They hired Don Pardo, who died yesterday at his Arizona home. Now, he was most famous to many as the voice of Saturday Night Live, but he also announced for the early years of Jeopardy and The Price is Right. Don Pardo was 96. Kids who don't see well can still exercise while having fun. Our Catherine Zeltner shows us how they're getting their kicks.
Let's play ball! Each one of these kids is visually impaired, but it doesn't stop them from kicking, running, and sliding into base. They're playing beep kickball.
It's played with 3 pieces of equipment. A kickball, which beeps, 2 bases, which buzz, and it blindfolds. All the kids wear blindfolds to equalize the differences in vision.
Beep Kickball founder Judy Bird says the rules are simple.
Kid kicks the ball, and he runs to the base that's buzzing. His job is to tag it before one of the 5 fielders out in the field locate the ball and pick it up.
11-year-old Christopher Abel was born blind and says he loves Beep Kickball.
It's exciting when you feel your foot hit the ball really hard and then you know it's just going flying.
Coach Melissa Allen says the benefits go beyond the physical.
The sport itself, it gives the kids a lot of confidence. A lot of times vision impaired students are not able to play a lot of athletic team sports.
For him, it's just the running. It's getting used to, with him being blind, running in an area where he's not going to run into something. He's not going to collide with anybody.
And for this young team, playing ball and having fun is what it's all about. Catherine Zeltner, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, 3,000 and counting. Efforts to keep up with the growing population of this refugee camp. And people are desperate. That grim assessment from World Vision's emergency response team in Iraq. On this Tuesday evening, thanks for joining us for EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick. A critical dam in Iraq is now under control of Kurdish forces. Sunni militants had controlled the dam for several weeks, but Kurdish fighters, Iraqi forces, and U.S. airstrikes helped to reclaim the dam. Now the Kurds have the dam under control, and they hope to soon regain control of that entire region. A refugee camp near Erbil, Iraq, is struggling to shelter about 3,000 Iraqis fleeing Islamic State fighters. The camp in the Kurdish region is run with partnership of the UN Commission for Refugees. Humanitarian organizations are working to provide food, water, mattresses, ice, and other supplies. Close to 1.5 million people have been displaced by fighting in Iraq since the Islamic State's rapid advance began in June. The scale of the crisis has prompted the UN to declare its highest level of emergency. Nathaniel Hurd is the Senior Policy Advisor for Conflicts and Disasters at World Vision. World Vision has an emergency response team on the ground in Iraq. So what are the first steps your team has to embark on?
So whenever we respond to a disaster, the most important thing is finding out what the needs are and then finding out who the most vulnerable people are. For example, women that have lost their husbands. There was a family that we spoke to. She's a mother of 6. Her husband was killed in the conflict, and she's now the sole provider.
So we have some pictures that your team has provided to us. Why don't you tell us what we're looking at?
So these are pictures of children that we actually spoke to as part of our assessment. The house that you're seeing right there, it's actually not really a house, it's more of an abandoned building. It's fairly typical of where a lot of these families are living. They're staying wherever they can find space, abandoned buildings, churches, schools, host families, anywhere that they can find a place to live.
So you previously advised the UN on Iraq's policy. How has this refugee crisis sparked the UN strategy, or how should it, I should say?
Well, before this crisis, Iraq was really it was a long-term economic development context. Now suddenly the UN is having to pivot to respond to an emergency like this. The good news is they're somewhat used to it. They do this all over the world, as do agencies like World Vision. But right now the focus is on meeting humanitarian needs.
Looking at those pictures, those are kids like you would see anywhere. And here they are in this situation with their families, probably living in fear. Didn't you, in fact, make a trip there?
I did. I've been to the region several times, and the stories are just heartbreaking. It's very hard for us to imagine here safely in the United States what it's like to have to leave in the middle of the night. If you have time to take anything at all, you can only take what you can fit into your pockets and leave everything behind. In some cases, family, certainly friends, places that you've lived and known your entire life. It's very hard for us to imagine.
So having seen it, how has that changed the way you look at this situation, and how can you connect us in that way?
It's very easy for this all to become very abstract, especially because the numbers are so large. 1.5 million people displaced. These numbers are almost unreal. For me, just having time to actually spend with families, to perhaps share a meal with them, but to hear their stories, their names, they're people with personalities. The parents want exactly what parents want for their children here. I was thinking of how the school year is just about to start here in the United States. The schools in this area are filled with these displaced people. So not only are the children unable to go to school, but if the situation is not resolved quickly, then over 800,000 Kurdish children will not be able to go to school in September.
Well, that really does help make a much more personal connection. This is not something remote. These are people. They're individuals, children of God like you and me. Nathaniel Hurd with World Vision, thank you for joining us tonight.
You're welcome.
Up next, New York debates the so-called poor door, combining upscale and subsidized housing. And Pope Francis offers a blessing and expresses a willingness to someday visit China. August the 19th, a Tuesday evening, and we appreciate you joining us here on EWTN News Nightly. Valets, beware. Corvette drivers may soon know what you're doing while parking their sports car. Chevrolet is adding a valet mode to its Corvette models. When activated, it records video on a forward-looking camera and also audio from inside the car. It's a feature that starts with the 2015 model year. It'll cost about $1,800 extra. Separate entrances and amenities for haves and have-nots in some New York City buildings are sparking sharp debate there. Our Catherine Elliott reports tonight.
The entrance seems underwhelming for this luxury building under construction on Manhattan's west side. That's because the main entrance is around the corner, reserved for those who buy the condos at market rate. The other door, for people who pay steeply reduced rent under a government program. And the so-called poor door is rubbing some people the wrong way.
Because New York City is a city where everyone mixes together. And this is a statement that no, you have to be separated by class, by caste system, by the amount of money in the bank.
There are similar buildings elsewhere in the city, like the Edge in Brooklyn. Condo owners enter here, while affordable housing renters enter here. Developers argue that these are technically two separate buildings side by side, made with different material, different architecture, and separate plumbing. Courtney Harding agrees. She lives on the luxury side of one of the buildings.
What people don't understand is the doorman and the amenities are paid for by common charges, and people in the subsidized housing don't pay common charges.
Lawrence Espinal won a housing lottery to live at a drastically reduced rent. He's happy about his place, but is bothered by the separate entrance.
It's like they don't want us.
Another tenant, who says he got a great deal, sees it differently.
Because the condominium is the glass building, is over there. It's completely separate and completely different building.
In order to get big tax breaks or permission to construct bigger buildings in New York, developers agreed to build a certain number of affordable housing units in the same area. State Assemblywoman Linda B. Rosenthal is working to take away tax breaks for developers who add separate entrances.
The zoning resolution can be changed so that this kind of setup is not legal.
In a city with limited affordable housing options, it's no longer about getting in the door, but which door to use. Catherine Elliott, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Catherine. Back to school isn't just about the chance to learn for some children. For many in poorer urban communities, schools are their main source of meals. Well, a group in Chicago is trying to change that, helping kids eat better during these last weeks of summer break. It's a different sort of Meals on Wheels. A van travels the neighborhood, bringing food to children in need.
Best thing that we see from the kids is that they're waiting for us at the stop when we get there. They're excited. They're happy about the food, and you know, it's just kind of a community thing when you get together and you're able to give the kids their lunches, and they're very appreciative. All of them have great manners, and they're just really excited.
The program will continue until the Chicago Public Schools reopen after Labor Day. Well, Pope Francis is resting up today after a physically demanding trip to South Korea. On the flight home to Rome, while flying over China, Francis says he wants to have a dialogue with China, maybe even visit there someday. The Pope told reporters on the plane the church makes no conditions except they want the freedom to do its work in that country. Now, during this trip, the papal plane flew over China for the first time since the communists severed relations with the Holy See in 1951. The Pope was actually in the cockpit when the pilots were requesting flyover permission with Chinese air traffic controllers. The Pope sent a message of goodwill to the Chinese president on both legs of the long flight. The second one saying, "I wish to renew Your Excellency and your fellow citizens the assurance of my best wishes as I invoke divine blessings upon your land." Marion Smith is with us tonight. He's the executive director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Fund. He's here to discuss the relationship between Catholicism and communism in countries like Korea, North Korea, and China. So why does the Vatican not have relations with some of these Asian countries?
Right. Well, the Vatican doesn't have relations with countries like China, or the People's Republic of China, Vietnam, and a few others because of the revolutions and the wars that took place in the 1950s as a result of communist movements supported by the Soviet Union.
So the Holy See is willing to have these relationships, but the communist governments are not?
Well, a key element of communist regimes in Laos, Vietnam, North Korea, and China has been a tenet of atheism. And we see that any religious group that is not directly controlled by the Communist Party is viewed as a threat to the Communist Party's stranglehold on power.
So during his trip to Korea, the Pope did invite a delegation from North Korea to be present for the Mass. He did send this greeting to Communist China. What do you make of his tone toward this issue?
Well, I think his tone was reconciliatory and hopeful. And I think that the real problem rests with the communist regimes themselves. Certainly popes have an important role to play. If you look at what Pope John Paul II did confronting the Soviet Union, he supported and gave hope to the many, many dissidents who were confronting the Soviet rule in their home countries and who were fighting for religious liberty.
And he was very successful. He used love and peace where the communists believed much more in weapons and force. What can this Pope do to continue that effort that John Paul II started?
Well, I think with the Vatican and any other Western governmental organization or country, it has to be very clear that the truth will not be a casualty of our improved relations with China, or mainland China. And this includes the truth about Tiananmen Square, for example, that occurred 25 years ago this year. It includes the truth about the fate of millions of Christians and other religious minorities in China, which are not free to worship God in the way they see fit. We've seen dozens of demolitions of churches throughout China just in the last few months. So if China really would like to have an improved relationships with Western institutions, including the Vatican, it must take some real steps to see that Christians and other religious minorities in China can experience a greater degree of religious freedom.
There's actually an underground Catholic Church in China, and then there's the officially recognized church, the government recognized church, which really isn't connected with the Pope. That's a dilemma for the church, isn't it?
I think it is. I think it is. I believe the official church that you're referring to is translated Patriotic Association or something like this. And I think just in its name it signifies that it is viewed by the Communist Party as an organ to exercise power on those people in the population who might identify themselves as Catholic. This is not religious freedom, and this is not the freedom of conscience that Western-style democracies have upheld. And China is doing its people a disservice. And again, popes have historically, you look at Pope John Paul II and the current overtones of Pope Francis in Asia, it can play a very positive role in helping to open up these countries, which are still, if you look at China, it is an authoritarian country ruled by the Communist Party. Despite any economic reforms that may have been made since 1989, that is the reality.
The Victims of Communism Memorial Fund, the Executive Director, Marion Smith, with us tonight. Very enlightening. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And we want to thank each of you for joining us tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Of course, we're here 5 nights a week. Until tomorrow, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, watch again anytime you like on EWTN's YouTube page. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Thanks for watching. Good night, and God bless you.